Do I have to take this fucking thing off? There's more steps. I missed one. We'll talk about this later. Nice. This $220 NCASE M1EVO came flat packed in this box. And the NCASE M1EVO is interesting because it's a Micro-ATX or Mini-ITX case. And the best feature is that you can install up to 15 SSDs, just in case you want a lethal brick of storage in your computer. What most people don't know is that NCASE, FormDE, the SSU-PD Meshlicious, and the Streetcom FreeFlow 1 are all linked to the same guy. That's also where the lawsuits come in, but we'll talk about those another time. So the case, we got this on loan from a viewer. Thank you to the viewer who sent it in. And there are options for mesh panels like this one. Our viewer also bought the upgrade kit that in the flat pack box contained a glass panel. So there are options for the purchasing on the site that change the price, of course. And then this thing is meant to be highly configurable. So there are around 12 or so total configurations you could do with this, involving rotation of the power supply, movement of the motherboard, inversion of the whole system, and a couple of others that we'll talk about. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course we built a website for our CEO Snowflake because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. So for a quick walk around of the case, CNC aluminum everywhere, made by a different factory than the original NCASE. We'll talk about that as well. There was a not good parting of ways between Lian Li and NCASE, but this thing is heavily perforated in the top, and this is the top panel that goes on it, so reasonable amount of perforation there. And the front is solid. The back has a lot of ventilation as well. So you can see here we've got an extra fan installed. In the rear, there's some pass-through holes. There are 4 slots available for a video card. If you do all 4, you're going to run into breathing problems on the bottom, though. But that is where additional configurations come in. We'll talk about today. And the back side of the case, the other side, also has a mesh panel. Same style as the primary side. So that's the walk around of the case. Now for the configurations and the layouts, in rapid order, the M1 can do a standard configuration with a GPU at the bottom and a radiator on the side, an inverted GPU layout, a deeper vertical GPU layout, a Micro-ATX layout with a short power supply, the same with a long power supply, a rotated power supply layout, inverted Micro-ATX, and SFXL power supply, and another variant of large vertical GPUs. The case starts around $215 and scales up depending on the exact model and the accessories chosen, and it goes all the way up to $305 with the extra vertical GPU kit, a riser, and a glass side panel. That price range puts it firmly on the more expensive side, along with other boutique, low-volume ITX cases like the FormD T1 or the Thorzone Nanoc. The Cooler Master Ncore 100 Max we just reviewed, you should check that on the channel, is more expensive, but it comes with a cooler and a power supply bundled in. Total cost for the 3 parts is $400 for that one. So the M1EVO definitely appeals to the highly customizable aspect of Mini-ITX cases that a lot of people want. And the original NCASE dates back to the 2012 case that we have here, which this is actually a personal build of Jeremy on the team who reviewed the M1EVO. So he's got experience with the original from about 2012. And just perspective, that was a time when Skyrim had only been launched once. We were so naive. Todd Howard had so much less money. But this is the original, and there are quite a few differences with it. The number one is that Lian Li manufactured that case, and because of legal disputes, they are not making this one. And if you're really familiar with the original, some of those differences will be obvious to you. There's also a really interesting story that we'll maybe talk about in a different video. You can let us know if you're interested in hearing about it in the comments below, but it relates to the origins of NCASE, where more recently we've come to realize that the web of ITX cases that people like, especially in the boutique market, is kind of all connected to the same guy. It's like if you had one of those murder mystery boards with the red string, all of the cases come back to the same dude, even though they're under different companies, which is pretty interesting. But the one that is the most interesting is, again, this case, we had to do this take twice. And then the Meshlicious case, which is made by SUPD. So SSUPD is a subsidiary of Li & Li. It's a related company to it. They share the same family ownership. And these two are in a legal battle, NCASE alleging that Li & Li failed to pay for designs, and the lawsuit also alleges IP theft. And so comes the M1EVO from a different factory based in China as opposed to Li & Li's factories. Today we'll focus on the M1EVO just as a product though. So since it comes flat packed, that reduces the shipping and the labor costs, it moves the assembly to the user, and depending on your perspective, DIY assembly can be a positive. The whole thing is held together by lots of M3 screws with various Phillips 2 heads. Most people will only need to go through this process once to set it up how you want, although reconfiguring or rebuilding in the case frequently could get annoying due to the lack of easier to use toolless mechanisms. Now again, part of the customization is that it can fit Micro-ATX, which is great because Micro-ATX tends to be a little bit cheaper than Mini-ITX for similar capabilities, which is just the way the market is. But the fact that both of these can fit in here is impressive and speaks volumes to the options you have with this particular case, where really the main reason for this length is accommodating modern video cards. Compared to the original M1, now called the M1 Classic, the differences in manufacturing are pretty apparent, but part of this, again, goes back to the factory choice, where this one, as we understand it, is made by the same factory that makes the Form D T1. So even though it's still NCASE, it's the same designer, it really doesn't feel like it shares a ton of DNA with the original, which is fine. But for people who are really enthusiastic about the M1 Classic, you're gonna notice that difference. It might matter to you. We'll cover the configurations as fast as we can. So for the M1, the new one, the M1EVO, there are three primary configs. There's this one, which is just called M1. It's basically default. There's M1 Flipped, which inverts everything. And then there's also the M1 with the vertical GPU layout. And then there are some sort of sub-variations of those with things like the power supply configuration. So we'll start with the default config here. The most notable takeaway for this layout is pretty familiar. This is what we think would make the most sense for an air-cooled build in this case. You have good access to air, even if you were to install, which you shouldn't, and we didn't test with this, 15 SSDs. Even if you were to do that, the air is going to come in through the side here, through the ventilation, and through the holes in the top. Primarily, go through it, come out the back. The bottom, really, there's functionally no airflow here. The gap is to be measured in sub 5 millimeters for sure. And the video card, as long as it's a 2 or 2.5 slot card, so this is a true 2 slot, 4070, we have decent access to air. It's mostly going to pull in through holes in the back here, through PCIe slot covers, so that's where that air will come from, or through holes in the sides for pass-throughs, things like that. We get a little bit of air just circulating in the case through the back side, where you, again, have another one of those panels on the left side of the case. So that's the sort of airflow. It is 4 slots, which means you can install stupidly large video cards for a Mini-ITX case. This, in fact, is one of the least stupidly large options. There are more stupid large options that we'll talk about later, like the Gigabyte one. When you start installing cards of this size, there are 2 things to consider. The first is going to be clearance and access to air, where we'll just go ahead and do the swap to demo it. So currently with a normal height video card, we don't have a problem with routing really any 12-volt high power cable in here. But if we were to pull this card and swap it, can I get it from here? Yeah. What the fuck? Do I have to take this fucking thing off? There's more steps, I missed one. We'll talk about this later. Nice. Wham! So now what? Significantly later, what was I talking about? GPU height. So, I guess technically I should. Jesus, okay, that's good enough. So if you were to do a taller video card, technically it supports up to 142 millimeters in height, But you're gonna run into problems with 12-volt high power cables. 12-volt high power, 12-volt 2x6, you're gonna have to make such an extreme turn. This particular instance may not even realistically be possible. Doing like a 180-degree adapter or something might be the best option because otherwise there's just not a ton of clearance from the side panel. For CPU cooler clearance, it's 135 millimeters. We have a Noctua NHU9S in here. This is a 125 millimeter tower cooler, mini tower cooler. So you'd have another 10 or so of clearance on top of this. It's also possible to mount a liquid cooler in this setup by, you know what, I'm gonna leave it to B-roll. It's a lot of work to reconfigure this case, which is fine if you're doing it once, but it's a little temperamental. We have some complaints about the manual later, where you're almost better off flying blind than you are necessarily following the manual in some places. But the point is, you can take this top bar here and reorient that to the side of the case, and what that ends up doing is giving the option to mount a liquid cooler, a radiator here. The power supply rotates, and so you've got two major reconfigurations, and obviously this tower cooler goes away, and you end up with a liquid cooler instead. And we have footage for all that. With a liquid cooler in this position, the power supply has to be mounted to the right side rather than the front. That's the best way to do it anyway, since it'll have the best access to cool air through the side panel. The second main layout is called vertical GPU configuration, which, as the name implies, uses an add-on kit to mount the GPU to the bottom of the case in a vertical position. The motherboard is mounted in the lowest position within the case for this, giving up to 70 millimeters of space above it for additional radiator and fan clearance, which is definitely generous for cooling. The third configuration is called M1 flipped, which is the same as the first one, except it's upside down basically. The front and the rear panels are machined symmetrically enough to allow other parts of the case to be mounted on either side. However, we'd point towards this flipped layout or the vertical layout if using a thicker air-cooled GPU. It would likely be suffocated for air against the bottom of the case in the standard configuration. It's not possible to mount the GPU vertically though while the system is flipped. Total assembly time with the case, if you're really working through the manual, trying to figure it all out and make sure you get everything perfect and set up exactly how you want it, is somewhere in the 1 to a couple of hours range. So definitely factor that into your build time. It doesn't ship built. For dimensions, the M1EVO spec sheet quotes them as 366 by 160 by 256 millimeters, which calculates to 15 liters of volume. However, our measurements came in at 372 by 161 by 263 millimeters, and that's going to be the accurate one to use. That's 15.75 liters, and that's because we count the feet and any other protrusions as part of the dimensions because they affect potential positioning for some users. Onto the fit and finish, there are a lot of really clever uses of space in this case that allow it to accomplish some of the cool customizations. There's also a lot of downsides though, and we'll get into those, some kind of not fully thought through ideas. On the positive side first, the motherboard rail system right here, we think this is actually really clever. It's well executed. It's one of the better parts of the case where you can see there's a set of 4 screws here, and these are screwing into the standoffs. I don't know how good a shot we can get of that, but the standoffs in there are secured by those screws. So if we were to loosen them up and move them, there's 2 in slats and 2 in holes. You can adjust this whole motherboard down if you wanted to. And the video card, depending on thickness, you might have the clearance for that, or you go vertical. If you go vertical with it, that opens up room up here to accommodate radiators and things of that nature. It also just makes it more customizable in general. So that's well executed. Another positive is the power supply is really well thought out, and that it can rotate and move a couple different ways to accommodate video cards, SSDs, whatever it may be, radiators that mount on the top. So that's well done. On the negatives, so the ground clearance is the #1 for the cooling side of things, where this ground clearance is not sufficient for a card that's right up against the bottom of the case, like this card is. It'll breathe a little bit through the mesh side panel, where it's got, I don't know, about an inch of access here for air, but this is still suboptimal, and to really optimize it, you want taller feet. They do sell taller feet on the website. It's about 10 bucks. You get a 15 millimeter tall foot, and generally speaking, so our rule of thumb, and we've published this data in the past, is our findings have been that you need about a 1-inch clearance, so it'd be something like 25 millimeters from the ground to get the best unrestricted intake without it being comically tall. So could improve there. Another area of improvement that's maybe more relevant, since at least you've got side ventilation here, is the wear and tear of the metals and just their tolerances for damage to the metal, to the panels, the cosmetics out of the factory. The anodized surfaces wear relatively easily, but NCASE says it made this trade-off for better pricing. It also says that color variations, scratches, dents, or blemishes measuring up to 3 by 2 by 1 centimeters are, quote, standard and expected. It's crazy to us that NCASE felt it commonplace enough to explicitly note this and make it a policy. Luckily, for the viewer we borrowed the case from, though, there aren't any issues with that with this unit. Moving on to fitment, so the standard M1 configuration, the flipped config, CPU air coolers up to 135 millimeters can fit. In vertical GPU mode, that drops down to 50 millimeters. If using the thickest possible 4-slot GPU with more clearance opening up when using a thinner card close to the side panel. And liquid cooler support is also pretty generous, allowing up to 280 millimeter radiators to be mounted either to the top or high on the left side panel. For the GPU, maximum GPU fitment in both the standard M1 and flipped configs allows for cards up to 359 millimeters long, 142 mil tall from the PCI slot to the side panel, and 4 slots thick. The available thickness in M1 config is reduced if an ITX motherboard is mounted lower than the highest point, or if an M1EVO motherboard has the main by 16 slot lower than the first position. Vertically mounting the GPU opens up more headroom for taller cards, allowing for even the monstrous Gigabyte Aorus Master 4080 to fit inside. This is the largest GPU we're aware of on the market, so the NCASE can fit about anything for video cards. Now we're getting into a focused criticism section. So we've kind of dotted some criticisms and some positives throughout the video so far, but in a more targeted way. First of all, generally speaking, this case is not one we'd necessarily recommend by and large. There are users for it. We'll talk about that more in the conclusion section of the video. But the case feels unrefined. The value is not particularly competitive with other cases like the NCASE A4H2O. And there's just some sort of fit and finish or finicky or older style ways of doing things that we weren't really all that pleased with. So for example, to access the side panel, if you have one on there, oh, that's right. I forgot I forgot the, well, anyway, now my point from earlier is proven. Let's just pretend it's on there. Accessing the side panel requires removing the top. Not the worst thing. Some Lee and Lee cases are like that too. But one of the more annoying aspects is the amount of screws to get really much of anything done in this case, especially as you're configuring it initially, where a lot of this stuff for mature cases on the market, it's been moved into a combination of slots, tabs, hinges, things that can socket together mechanically with just the shaping of the metal, and maybe a screw in there somewhere, but it might also just snap, whereas this takes the approach of use screws for everything. The manual is also a mess. It's gone through a lot of revisions. It is important to have a well-written manual if they're gonna have one at all, because if it's not well-written, it'd be better off just letting the user figure it out. The M1EVO manual pre-1.0 revision was just plain bad. The newest version, which was just recently uploaded, still has several problems, such as instances where the wrong type of screw is called for in the wrong place. For example, countersunk screws are intended to be used in the matching conically machined locations, but they aren't always correctly called for by the manual. Prior assembly steps sometimes also disappear in the next step, or they get omitted altogether. The manual is incomplete at best, despite improvements over the past 2 months. This can be frustrating, but experienced builders won't have a problem figuring it out and working their way through it. First-time builders, however, may struggle in some of these areas. Unrelated to the manual, we also found that the fit of the front I/O is unfortunately loose. There's a lot of play in it, and this is just sort of a shame, considering the fine quality of machining on the bracket itself, and the case in general, and the high price. Speaking of front I/O, one of the USB Type-C ports requires use of an external style cable and routing it through to the rear I/O. This isn't terrible, it's just kind of an odd choice, but in fairness, there aren't a ton of ITX cases that have dual internal Type-C. For cooling, NCASE claims a triple 240 build is possible with radiators in the top, side, and bottom, but you would need taller case feet for the bottom radiator to have any effect, and ideally a little taller than the aftermarket option on the website. It also required careful planning and a lot of patience to get it all to fit, just as a warning. Another criticism too is installation of the GPU. So it's done in a clever way in the case. That's the positive. The downside is that it also highlights the ease of use issues that sometimes pop up with the M1EVO. On one hand, the expansion slot fingers fit into a nice groove that's milled into the edge of the rear panel. But on the other, it requires removing and replacing a plate and lock bar on the rear of the case during installation. This is necessary to facilitate both horizontal and vertical GPU mounting in the same physical space. However, having to do everything with screws is less convenient, and it's a less mechanically adept way of doing things as compared to other modern cases that accomplish the same horizontal to vertical flip with tabs and maybe a thumb screw. Setting the M1EVO up for a vertical GPU with a top-mounted CLC exposes more problems with the current version of the manual. The manual implies that the order of assembly for this layout goes like this. Install the power supply, then the motherboard, remove the rear plate, attach the vertical bracket to the case bottom, add the PCIe cable, and then finally install the GPU into the case and secure it with the rear bar, and you're done. One problem with this, it leaves out the CPU cooler part. So that means you end up with the video card installed and blocking access to the CPU cooler, so the steps are out of sequence. You'd obviously figure this out. You'd get to that step, probably, hopefully, stop before putting the video card in, but maybe a novice builder puts it in, they'd still figure it out. Like, wait a minute, wasn't there something else? But it just kind of goes back to the same point, which even though, yes, you can sort through this, it shows a certain level of lack of definition or refinement of some of the more important details of the product, like instructions. Following the suggested order anyway, just to see how the GPU would install, it reveals that it's not really possible to get a screw into the rear bar to secure the GPU vertically without removing the rear fan grille unless you're willing to bend it a little bit or potentially scratch it. And again, this easily scratches. This isn't mentioned in the manual at all. You should be removing that rear fan grille just to be safe. And it's a situation where tight tolerances create physical interlocks or dependencies that hamper ease of use. So those are some of the negatives in a condensed format. We've already talked about some of the positives throughout the video. Now let's get into the testing though. We're gonna run through thermal and acoustic in this. In our Fractal Terra review from a while ago, we sort of laid out the definition of what our objectives are with this testing if you wanna learn more about that side of things. And we're still refining it, but we have a good amount of data for you today. So let's take a look. For thermal testing with this case, we primarily evaluated 2 CPU cooler options in 6 total configurations. The coolers were the Noctua U9S and a Fractal Lumen S24 RGB liquid cooler. The testing was done at a normalized 31 dBA as collected in our Hemi anechoic chamber and at a 1 meter distance with a noise floor of about 13.6 dBA. The other test was quieter, conducted at 27 dBA and reduced fan speeds. This helps us evaluate performance under maximum fan speeds and under reduced fan speeds. The GPU fan is controlled for all tests and at the same level. Remember that testing multiple coolers in an ITX case, it's basically bordering on functionally just a CPU cooler review, which we do separately with more controls. And obviously a larger liquid cooler will outperform a smaller air cooler, but the point of including both is to help you make a decision for a build in this case because it has a lot of options. As a note, this test uses a vertical GPU for the CLC entries and a horizontal one for the U9S entries. So they're not perfectly isolated to a single change, and that's because we're offering a holistic picture of 2 complete configurations that we think are pretty likely for the M1EVO. First, tested at 1 meter for 31 dBA normalized for total system noise, we end up with this chart for CPU thermals with a couple entries for 31. Shown as delta T over ambient of 21C, the vertical GPU configuration without the glass panel had the CPU at 46 degrees over ambient. It's about 2 degrees cooler than our result for the glass panel config. This particular configuration didn't hurt CPU performance meaningfully, but did affect it. The same glass panel comparison had no impact on our CPU thermals when using the Noctua U9S. Again, comparing the 2 coolers to each other is just a cooler review, except in a less controlled environment. But even still, between the 2 and noise normalized, we determined about a 10-degree advantage for the liquid cooler with this heat load. That will amplify if you go to a hotter CPU at higher power draw, where these air coolers might not be able to keep up. Dropping to the slower fan speed on the CLC still gets us below the performance of the M1 config U9S. Not a surprise, that's a big cooler versus a tiny one. The reduction on the U9S increases temperature by about 5 to 6 degrees like for like. GPU thermals are way more interesting. Using the glass panel and vertical orientation significantly hurt GPU performance, pushing it from a 63 degree hotspot to 77 delta T over ambient, which has it approaching 100 degrees when at 21 degrees Celsius ambient factored back in. The average GPU temperature was 46 degrees over ambient without glass and 58 with glass. A significant performance degradation. We wouldn't advise a vertical installation with a glass panel. This is true in all cases. We also advise against it for ATX unless using a vertical mounting kit that provides sufficient distance between the glass and the video card. In the M1 configuration, the GPU runs much cooler as a result of the horizontal layout, and that's despite a significant change in the CPU cooler, which also means a change in fans in the case. So the NCASE obviously has a storied history. A lot of people really loved this case, the M1 Classic, and that makes it a little bit harder to list some of the criticisms of this because that was well received and now it's old enough that it's viewed through a different lens. At the end of the day, the only thing the NCASE M1EVO really masters, and it does master it, is letting the user kind of do whatever they want. There are a lot of options with the case. If you have a specific project in mind, great, because probably this can accommodate it. But on the negative side of things, you could really tell a difference in factories. They're still working together as companies to figure that side of things out. And some of the fit and finish just isn't up to the standards we would expect for a $200+ case. The value is poor. It is, however, a lower run product, like a lot of the Mini-ITX cases, and oddly, some of the ones it competes with, despite being made by companies linked to the same people. But it is lower value than some of the other ITX cases on the market. That much is just fact. The DAN case A4H2O, as an example, $150. If you're buying on value, that's a better value. But the A4H2O is a guided experience. You buy it, this is the way you build this computer. There's not a whole lot of deviation there. This is kind of like a start to finish choose your own adventure of building a Mini-ITX PC. And if that's appealing to you, great. The case is acceptable for all of that. And thermally, as we saw in the testing earlier, it does fine in most configurations. There's some considerations we talked about, but for the most part, you can get the job done pretty well thermally and acoustically if you choose parts that are competent for cooling. And again, some of the other positives include things like, well, the fact this bar can be moved in different ways to accommodate radiator mounts. You can relocate the motherboard vertically in the slat system, which is awesome. The power supply can rotate multiple locations, also a great feature. They are planning to sell options again for ATX add-ins. That's good too for ATX form factor power supplies. So there's a lot you can do with the case. Those are all the positives. It's just, it comes down to that fit and finish that needs some more refinement, we think. So the M1EVO is a case for enthusiasts or tinkerers. And that's mostly because other cases have done a better job mastering the ease of installation features. This case can still have those features, even if it's a tinkerer's case. It's just they're not refined yet. Price ranging from $215 to $305 or so, depending on the model and kit chosen, does make it in that boutique, more expensive tier of ITX. We do think it has impressive versatility, layouts, and packaging. The quality of machining is high, despite those fit and finish complaints that are mostly related to ease of installation. The manual still needs more work to be helpful. It's expensive enough that the blemish and scratch policy doesn't make a ton of sense to us. And we do like the amount of options that they have on the website for different variants. That does contribute to some of the price that we see, though, where they're just splitting up more and more low-run productions of different components. So anyway, that's kind of our review of the case. We don't outright recommend it. We don't outright completely dismiss it, but I wouldn't say that we're neutral. So this is where subjectivity comes into play. Jeremy and I have a different approach to building things like this. For me, I found it very frustrating to work with a couple of the parts, like for the video card mounting, where the order of operations, it doesn't feel quite as put together as some of the other cases I've worked on. For Jeremy, he seems to like the walking through each step of it and starting from scratch. He did, however, I'll caveat this, complain a lot about the amount of screws and the manual. He really struggled with the manual, especially the early revisions. It's gotten a little bit better, so you won't see it quite as bad as it was. But that's the two different approaches. I asked him, since he was a little more positive on it in general, No other detail, absolutely no nuance, yes or no, would you buy this case? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said no. And I feel the same way. Now, I don't think you shouldn't buy this case, because what he and I both agreed on for the conclusion was, if you have a specific project and this fits your project, awesome. We don't really have a ton of complaints about the overall build quality or the customization. In fact, customization is great, and that's why it survives any part of this review and can get a recommendation for that type of audience. If it didn't have the customization, it shipped in one config and that was it, the review would be plain and simple. Go buy something else. But it's that expandability that allows it to find a place in this market, especially at the pricing. So anyway, that's our review of it. We know a lot of people like NCASE, but there's they need to do some refinement on this one, and that'll come with time and experience working with the new factory. So thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go check out our other ITX reviews we've done. The Dan case, we did this Encore from Cooler Master recently, and we're open to ideas for what to review next. So leave those in the comments below. If you have a specific ITX case you want us to look at, go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.